Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you all for coming out to hear my talk. I appreciate the Villanova Department of Sociology and Criminology for sponsoring it. And I've decided to talk about an aspect of my book, Torn Apart, that brings together criminology and sociology and law by focusing on the ways in which what I call family policing, and I'll explain that, what most people know of as the child welfare system, how it intersects and is really entangled with criminal law enforcement. So I'll start with telling stories of three families, just to give you a little sense of how the child welfare system operates and how it intersects and engages with the criminal legal system, especially police. The first is the story of Tyrone Denier and Saisha Mercado, who were driving down with their brand new 9-day-old baby on a highway in Florida when officers of the Manatee County Sheriff's Department pulled their car over and demanded that they turn over their newborn baby to caseworkers who had accompanied the police. And Ms. Mercado is screaming and crying, desperately trying to hold on to her newborn baby, asking what's wrong. She's perfectly healthy, she's perfectly happy, she's well taken care of, all of which were true. And she's breastfeeding. How are you going to feed my baby? What's going to happen to her? But she was forced by the sheriffs to turn over the baby to caseworkers. And the reason why she had to do this is because the judge had issued what's called a pickup order to pick up this baby and take her, in this case, from her parents' custody and place her in foster care. Now, why did that happen? Well, that happened because when Ms. Mercado was pregnant with this baby, she also had a toddler son. She was trying to transition from breastfeeding to solid food. And he wasn't doing well. He wasn't accepting the solid food, and she was concerned about his health. So she took him to a hospital in St. Petersburg to be checked out and to get some help. But instead of helping her, the hospital staff called the child abuse hotline on her and alleged that the baby was failing to thrive, and she was charged with medical neglect. Because she was charged with medical neglect, the hospital took custody of the baby, and the newborn, the toddler, okay, before the newborn, right? She's pregnant with the baby, and put him in foster care. So when the baby was born, she now is under the supervision of the child welfare system. She's been deemed a neglectful mother, and so a judge took custody of the baby, and now both of her children are in foster care as a result of her seeking medical help at a hospital. The next story, the Claiborne and Williams family story in Tennessee in February 2023, just this past February, involves a family that was traveling from Georgia to Chicago for a funeral. And they were pulled over by police in Tennessee because the car windows were tinted too dark. The police found inside the car a small amount of marijuana, just the amount you would smoke. And because of that, they arrested the father for drug possession. And while the family was at court in Tennessee, caseworkers came in and took custody of their 5 children for grounds of child neglect because there was marijuana found in their car. So that's the second story. Third story is the Jackson family. A month later, in March of 2023, this family had a baby at home under the supervision of a midwife, and when they took her to their pediatrician, the family pediatrician, he diagnosed the baby with jaundice. They wanted to care for the baby at home under the supervision of a midwife, which many people do. You can deal with jaundice at home. But the doctor wanted to be the one to treat the jaundice. And when they disagreed with him, he called the child abuse hotline on them. And police officers arrived at their home, arrested the father, and put the baby into foster care. So we have 3 stories here, very recent stories, of Black families whose children were taken from them based on some form of neglect, and where the police were involved in seizing the children from the family. And in the case of the Jackson family, the police were involved in making the allegations, the initial allegations of child neglect. Now, these aren't aberrational stories. They're not aberrational in the sense that they reflect the typical approach of the U.S. child welfare system or child protective services, which is not to be aimed at improving children's welfare. Certainly in all 3 cases, there's little doubt that these children were harmed more than they were helped by the intervention of police and caseworkers, traumatized by being taken from their parents without any evidence that the parents had harmed them. But the way in which the children's welfare is protected by this system is to accuse parents or other family caregivers of mainly neglecting their children. Neglect is the main reason why children are taken from their families, and this is because the parents are accused of failing to provide some resource for the children, housing or clothing or food, or in this case, medical care, or not supervising them well enough, or having a dangerous environment. But the dangerous environment can be having drugs in the home, it can be being houseless and living in a homeless shelter, it can be not following a doctor's instructions, it can be a suspicion that the reason why a child isn't doing well is because of the parent's fault. And it almost always happens to low-income or impoverished families. In fact, the very definition of neglect is in some ways a definition of poverty. It's failing to meet the material needs of children. And most of the time when parents fail to meet children's needs, it's because they can't afford to. So this is a system that's directed primarily at impoverished families or low-income families. Everything that happened in these cases that I mentioned would never have caused child removal if we were talking about a wealthy white family. I just happened to, this afternoon, listen briefly to an interview with the star of iCarly. She's had a book on the New York Times bestseller list for months and months. It's called I'm Glad My Mom Died. I don't know if you've noticed this. But the reason she's glad her mom died is because her mother basically taught her to be anorexic. And this was a star on TV. Her doctors knew her mother was doing this. Everybody knew. They were never going to call Child Protective Services on her. But Saisha Mercado gets her child taken, her baby and toddler taken from her when she goes to seek help for a child who is deemed to be failing to thrive. So it's not only that the reasons why children are taken by the system have to do with poverty, it's also that the very same kinds of behaviors, smoking marijuana, drinking alcohol, that wealthy people do, don't cause their children to be taken from them. When impoverished people do it, then it's seen as a reason to take their children away. You know, wealthy people boast on TV about smoking marijuana or drinking alcohol in order to cope with the stress of taking care of their children. During COVID, there were op-eds and blogs and all sorts of social media by wealthy parents talking about how they turned to drugs and alcohol. And nobody went after them to take their children away from them. So this is a system that targets impoverished and low-income families to punish them for not being able to meet their children's needs. It's also not an aberration that these were all black families. The child welfare system disproportionately targets black families and black communities, as well as Native communities, for investigation, supervision, and child removal. I have up here, you probably can't see it, but these are recent studies that have documented the really high risk of child removal in the United States, period, for all families compared to other nations, but it's especially high for Black and Native families. And one really astounding figure that came out recently is the rate of child welfare investigations in the United States. Now, most child welfare investigations, which are mostly triggered by calls to child abuse hotlines, end up in what's called unsubstantiated reports. Caseworkers go to the home and investigate, but in the majority of cases, they find there's not enough evidence to continue the investigation, or certainly not enough to remove children from the home. But these investigations are very traumatic. You have strangers coming to your home and searching every corner of it, opening the refrigerator, opening closets, drawers, asking you questions, every member of the family, interrogating them, interrogating children apart from their parents. I mean, imagine how scary that is for a little kid to be awakened in the middle of the night and told that they have to answer questions by a stranger. And if you live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of child welfare investigations, all the children know that they're at risk of being taken from their parents. So as they're being interrogated, they know these people might take me away from my parents, from my siblings, from my friends, from my classmates. And they also often strip search children to look for evidence of abuse, even when that wasn't the allegation that they came there for. So these are very traumatizing investigations, experiences for children and their families, all under the threat that we might be taking your children from you right then and there. And this study in 2017 found that half of Black children in America will experience one of these investigations by the time they reach age 18. Okay, so think about that. 53%, most Black children in America will undergo a child welfare investigation. So these are very common experiences, although they still affect a minority of families. There's about 3 million investigations a year in the United States, and 200,000 children taken from their homes every single year, with probably another 200,000 children who are taken from their homes based on what's called voluntary service plans, voluntary case plans, but they're really coerced. Parents are coerced into signing these. So lots of children put in foster care every year, but most children aren't. And so there are lots and lots of Americans who really don't know what this system does at all. And if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you're very unlikely to have any encounters with the child welfare system. But if you live in an impoverished Black neighborhood, everybody knows about this system. And most of the children will undergo an investigation at some point. So I became aware of this system and how it operates in the late 1980s when I was working on my first book, Killing the Black Body. And the way I became aware of it is an indication of the connection between this civil system of child protection and the criminal legal system. I was investigating the prosecutions of black women for being pregnant and using drugs. So in the late 1980s, prosecutors, for the first time in US history, began to charge pregnant women with crimes for using drugs while they were pregnant. And the prosecutions were almost all targeted at black women, even though we know that white women are just as likely to use drugs while they're pregnant. This is a problem that cuts across class lines as well as racial lines, but these prosecutions were targeted at black women. And I thought that was unconstitutional, unjust, racist, and I began to investigate them and write about them, and that eventually led to a book about more subjects, Killing the Black Body. But while I was investigating the prosecutions, I discovered that many more black mothers, tens of thousands of black mothers across the United States, were having their babies taken from them at birth because of a positive drug test. And studies were showing that this was extremely racially biased. In fact, one study in 1990 in Florida found that black mothers were 10 times more likely to have their babies taken from them than white mothers who use drugs. In fact, in the study, the white mothers use drugs more. There's a higher rate of drug use, but black mothers were 10 times more likely to be reported and their babies removed from them. And so I said, oh my goodness, this is worse than prosecutions. And for many people, taking your child away from you is worse than being prosecuted for a crime. And so I started looking into it, and I found out that there were over 500,000 children in foster care. And at the time, the largest group of children in foster care were black children, even though black children were a minority of children in the United States. So it was very clear to me that this was a system targeting black families and taking their children away for allegations that other families were doing as well, but were not being supervised and punished and disrupted and even destroyed in this way. So I wrote a book published in 2001 called Shattered Bonds, The Color of Child Welfare, where I just documented this huge disparity in the intervention in families. And I argued that this is a form of racial injustice. At the time, there hadn't even been a book written about this topic since the 1970s, and I didn't see it on the agenda of any civil rights organization or racial justice organization. And it was really astounding to me that there could be this kind of punishment and harm and trauma inflicted in black communities without anyone raising an alarm about it. And surely people in the system could see this. I could see it right away. I was teaching at Northwestern Law School at the time, and I began to observe court hearings in family court in Chicago. And all I saw were black mothers being told they couldn't get their children back from foster care. It was obviously a racially targeted system. And I thought everybody working here, all the lawyers, all the judges, all the caseworkers, they all know this. They see it every day. Why isn't anybody speaking out against it? Anyway, I spent 20 years after publishing Shattered Bonds working on reforms in the system. I spoke to lots of groups of social workers and caseworkers. I wrote reports for foundations. I met with heads of child welfare departments, and some of them began to look at ways of reducing the racial disparities in the system. I also spent 9 years working in Washington State, or at least I made trips from Chicago to Washington State, as one of 5 national experts who were supposed to get Washington State to transform its foster care system after a judge found that it was violating the constitutional rights of foster children in the state. The named plaintiff in the case had been moved over 30 times to different placements while she was in foster care, completely disrupting her social life, her social relationships, her education, her medical care. And this was typical of what happened to children in foster care. They're bounced from home to home to home and unable to form healthy relationships with caregivers. They were running away. There was a huge problem of runaways, children who just can't take it anymore and leave foster care placements and end up living in the streets, or being arrested because they ran away and being put into juvenile detention then. And problems with school records, with medical records, just a whole slew of problems that we were supposed to fix. This settlement agreement was supposed to last for 7 years. After 7 years, it was clear little progress had been made, and we spent 2 more years. So in 9 years we spent trying to fix this system. Just this one part of the system. This wasn't about investigations, it wasn't about reporting, it wasn't even about the racial disparities in the system. It was just about taking care of the children that you've taken from people's families, not harming them more while they're in state custody. Just that little thing, and we couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. So I came to the conclusion after all these efforts trying to fix this system that it can't be fixed. And it can't be fixed because it's based on a dangerous idea. It's based on the idea that the reason why children in America struggle, the way they don't have adequate housing, why they don't have adequate food or medical care or clothing, is because of their pathological parents. And so their parents are accused of harming them. Their parents are investigated, are supervised, are given all sorts of tasks to perform. They have to go to parent training classes, and they have to meet with caseworkers, and they have to appear in court. They have to have supervised visits. They have to go to therapy. You know, that's typically what they're told to do. They're not given the resources. They're not given housing. They're not given clothing. They're not given food. You know, they're not given higher wages or income. And so this blames parents for harms that they didn't really cause for their children. And it diverts our attention from what we really need to do to care for children in America. You know, instead of having the highest child poverty rate of any Western nation and taking away more children than any Western nation, why don't we flip it around and stop taking so many children and end child poverty? That's what would be a true child welfare system. That's what would protect children. But instead we do the opposite. We blame parents and punish them and traumatize children, take them away, put them in a harmful foster system, and ignore the true causes of harm to children. So part of the reason why this system is so harmful and is rooted in this false thinking about why children have unmet needs in America is because the roots of the system are in slavery and settler colonialism. If we think about where does the practice of taking children away from their families come from, we would have to look at the institution of slavery in America. That is the oldest, the most deeply rooted system of family separation in America. And that is because enslavers had complete authority over enslaved families and children, and their parents had absolutely no legal authority whatsoever with respect to their children. Enslavers legally owned their children, and they did frequently separate children from their parents, including at the auction block. For the minute a family was being sold to enslavers, you could have one purchase the father, another purchase the mother, and you could have separate enslavers purchasing children separately, and they would never see each other again. Once they were on a plantation and families were together, the enslaver could decide at any moment to sell off any family member, and you could not object. There was no legal objection to it at all. Could be for economic reasons, it could be to punish the family, it could be because he wanted to give a gift of a child to a friend. These were the images that led to the abolition of slavery and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. Images that, I show one there, of black mothers pleading not to be separated from their babies. You know, and I can't help but see Saisha Mercado pleading not to be separated from her baby as a modern manifestation of this practice. After slavery ended and the Civil War was won by the North, white Southerners wanted to take back control of black labor. And they did this through the prison system, chain gangs, convict leasing system, which you may have been taught about or read about, but less attention has been paid to the child apprenticeship system, which was the way in which former white enslavers took back child labor, the labor of black children. You know, during slavery, of course, black children were not free to play and have fun or learn. They had to work. And emancipation was a loss of child labor for former white enslavers. And so they used the court system and filed petitions claiming that black parents were neglectful. And judges would order the children to be child apprentices for white people, which meant that they were forced to work, sometimes for their very same former enslavers. They went right back to work for them as if slavery had never ended. And tens of thousands of black children were forced into this apprenticeship system to work for white people. At the very same time, the US military was fighting wars against Native tribes, dispossessing them, exterminating them to take their land. And they arrived at a military strategy of forcibly removing Native children from their homes, kidnapping them basically, and keeping them in military camps and later in boarding schools. And some tribes were completely decimated, extinguished as a result of this kidnapping of Native children. So for Native people in America, child removal was a weapon of war against them by the US military. That turned into what was called the adoption policy that extended into the 1970s of caseworkers taking Native children away, putting them in white-dominated orphanages and getting them adopted into white homes. This was an official policy of the US government and the child welfare system. And even for white children, the origins of the child welfare system are taking impoverished immigrant children from their homes, mostly in northern cities, like New York City was actually where we can see the origins of the child welfare system for white families, but again, only directed as a kind of charitable movement for impoverished children. But they were put into foster homes and forced to work too. And this image I have here all the way to the right is a photograph of of what was called an orphan train, where tens of thousands of white children were put on these trains after being taken from their parents. They were called orphan trains, but most of the children's parents were still alive. They were just poor, and sent to the Midwest and Southwest to work for farmers, work on farms. Again, another form of forced labor of children. These are the origins of the child welfare system in America. Then Black children began to be the largest number of children in foster care. You know, as I mentioned, by the mid-1990s, the foster care population had skyrocketed, and the largest group of children in foster care were Black children. And this was the result of a white backlash against civil rights gains, where Southern states used the welfare laws and what eventually became federal foster care law in order to deny welfare benefits to Black families and put their children in foster care. And we see a complete change in child welfare policy. Prior to this time, most of the money spent in the child welfare system was services to families in their homes. As soon as Black children began to come under the formal child welfare system, the policy began to shift so that much more money, in fact, now 10 times as much money, is spent on maintaining children outside their homes and not services to children in their homes. And that only began when Black children began to be removed from their homes and placed in foster care. In the 1990s, I've already mentioned the prosecutions of Black women for being pregnant and using drugs. That policy was fueled by negative stereotypes about Black mothers, painting them as innately unfit to care for children, and in fact dangerous to their children. And so we see very popular stereotypes like the Black welfare queen, a mother who got pregnant just to get a welfare check and then spent all the money on herself, didn't care for her children. And these kinds of images also, the prosecutions were based on the myth of the so-called crack baby, that for some reason crack use during pregnancy had these peculiar effects on infants that weren't present for any other kind of baby exposed to drugs, and they were portrayed as irredeemable, unable to learn, destined to be criminals, destined to be dependent on welfare. All of that has been completely refuted by subsequent research, but it was a very powerful stereotype during the late 1980s and into the 1990s. And so these kinds of stereotypes about Black mothers help to support the removal of their children. It's been well proven that by sociologists that it takes more harm or risk for a white child to be removed from the home than a Black child. It's easier for caseworkers to take Black children from their homes for the exact same alleged harms or risks as white children. Let's just give you an example of a study that was conducted in Minnesota of thousands of caseworkers, where the researchers added to a training that all caseworkers in Minnesota got, where they showed half of the caseworkers randomly assigned a photo of what they called a dirty home. This was a basis for removing children, was a dirty home. And they had a photo of a disheveled bedroom and a baby on the bed. The only difference between the two groups of caseworkers was one group got the same bedroom, same image, but they put a Black baby on the bed, and another set got the photo with a white baby on the bed, same disheveled bedroom. Do you think it made a difference to caseworkers which one they said was a neglected child and neglectful family? It made a significant difference. They were far more likely to answer the quiz, and say, this is a neglected child, when the baby was black. And I could go on and on with all the evidence that has shown racial bias in these kinds of decisions. And where does that come from? I think part of it is fueled by these longstanding stereotypes that have circulated in US society that a black baby must be more neglected than a white baby because black parents are more neglectful. Now, these ideas and stereotypes and politics led to three carceral and punitive policies passed in the 1990s that again show this integration of criminal law enforcement and family policing. First was the Crime Control Act of 1994 that increased the numbers of police officers in black communities and also helped to expand prisons. The next, in 1996, was the welfare restructuring law, the law that ended the federal entitlement to aid to dependent children. Prior to 1996, there was a federal entitlement to welfare for families that were struggling. That ended in 1996, and now states have wide latitude not to give any benefits, to give little benefits, to cut people off of welfare, to put all sorts of conditions on receiving welfare. And then the next year, the Adoption and Safe Families Act was passed, and this is a law that was supposed to deal with all the black children languishing in foster care. And people recognized that there were a large number of black children in foster care. And the solution Congress came up with wasn't to put fewer black children in foster care or to encourage them to be returned to their families. It was the opposite. It was to speed up termination of parental rights so that the children could be put up for adoption. And along with that law, speeding up termination of parental rights, and by the way, termination of parental rights means children and their parents have no legal relationship with each other, and the children can be adopted by another family, completely cutting out the birth family of the child. And so there was that, the speeding up of termination of parental rights, and financial bonuses to states that increase the numbers of children adopted. So if you look at these policies together, you could interpret them as increasing punitive approaches to poverty in America, cutting people off welfare and putting more people in prison and taking their children away from them. Now, another connection between the criminal legal system and the child welfare system is the way in which police officers and caseworkers work together. I already gave you some instances of that in the three stories I told at the beginning of my talk. And this is not, again, as I said, aberrational. Caseworkers will call police officers to come with them on home searches and to remove children from their homes, so that you have an armed officer adding extra force and fright to a family when caseworkers show up, or when they show up and say, we're taking your children away from you. They train together in many states. They have contracts with each other in many states. And police officers, as I pointed out at the beginning, also are reporters of child maltreatment to child welfare departments. Now, I pointed out that In some ways, police help caseworkers do their job by adding armed force to the demands of the caseworkers. But there's also a way in which caseworkers help police officers, because police officers are supposed to have a warrant before they search a home. They're supposed to tell you, if you're the suspect of a crime, that you have a right to a lawyer before you answer questions. Caseworkers hardly ever do those things. They hardly ever come with a warrant. I personally, I've studied many, many cases. I don't know anyone who's ever said, oh, they showed me a warrant. And I know lots of cases where they don't. And I know this just from empirical studies as well, that they don't come with a warrant. They just knock on the door and say, let me in. You've been accused of some form of child maltreatment, and let me in, or we're going to come back and take your children from you. And so people let them in. And they don't know they have rights. Caseworkers are government agents who search homes. That's covered by the Fourth Amendment. That might come as a surprise to many people. The Fourth Amendment applies just as much to caseworkers as it applies to police officers, but it is rarely applied. And so when police officers accompany caseworkers, they get to go into homes without a warrant. So it adds to the power that police have to search homes, because they can adopt this view that is prevalent, that for some reason social workers don't need the same kinds of authority from a judge that police officers do. Now, in addition to the searches that caseworkers do and the kinds of information they collect, this is being exponentially expanded through high-tech surveillance. When state child welfare departments, like many police departments are doing, hire companies to put together some high-tech way of surveilling communities. You may be aware that police departments are increasingly using digitized, computerized databases and algorithms to predict where crime is going to take place. So child welfare departments are increasingly also entering into multi-million-dollar contracts with IBM and SAS and Deloitte and other companies like that to predict where child maltreatment is going to take place. And I don't want to spend the time to go over this excerpt. These are screenshots from this company's website, Analytics for Child Wellbeing, but the company boasts that it will get information from any source to assist child welfare departments. It has its own analytics. Of course, this is all trademark and privacy protected. We don't know what those algorithms are. They're proprietary information to then alert child welfare departments of which children are at risk. And if you've looked into this at all, you will know that there is much evidence of all sorts of biases in these high-tech forms of digital surveillance. Including one that's been in the news lately is facial recognition and people who've been falsely arrested based on faulty facial recognition technology, and all of them have been Black people, by the way. This system also criminalizes Black children. It criminalizes children in general, but especially Black children are at higher risk than other children of being put into juvenile detention as a result of being in foster care, of being arrested and even shot by police officers Ma'Khia Bryant, for example, a 16-year-old in Ohio shot by police as a result of an altercation while in foster care. They also are more likely to be put into what's called residential treatment facilities, which are very much like prisons. I have here quotes from a study of children who had been put into institutions as foster children, and the very common expression that they felt as if they were being treated as a criminal, a dog in a cage, degraded, confined, punished, restricted. And the images of these two young men, both 16-year-olds, are two black teenagers who were killed by staff as foster children, being cared for by the state. Cornelius Fredericks, because he threw a piece of bread in the cafeteria. All right, I'm gonna move a little bit. I'm gonna skip a little bit because I want to leave time for Q&A. We got started a little late, so I want to make sure I leave time for you to ask questions. We have a little discussion, but I do want to point out how mandated reporting, the requirement that people, professionals who work with children, doctors, teachers, social workers, are supposed to report their suspicions of child maltreatment to state authorities. And this expands even more the kind of surveillance that this agency can do of families, because it basically is deputizing now civilians, people who aren't working directly for Child Protective Services, to be their agents out there looking for child maltreatment. Now that might sound good. Don't we want people to report when they suspect a child is being harmed? Except once again, lots of evidence showing that this is very, very racialized, racially biased, and it's mandated for impoverished families. It's not mandated for wealthy families. Again, very clear that doctors and teachers, in private schools and in fancy clinics aren't reporting their patients and their wealthy parents to Child Protective Services because they suspect that a child is being neglected at home. I mean, they might be neglected by putting them in the private school. As I pointed out, lots of wealthy children have all sorts of problems, and their parents don't get blamed for it in the sense that they're going to be accused of child maltreatment. So mandated reporting is not really mandated reporting. And it's also important to remember, you don't need to be mandated to report harm to a child. You are always free to do it. So ending mandated reporting doesn't prevent anybody from reporting harm to a child, but mandating it is an invitation to discriminate against families. Okay, another problem with it is that it deters people who do need help from going to get it. I mean, imagine Saisha Mercado tells her friends about how she went to St. Petersburg Hospital to get help for her toddler, and they took him away and they took her baby away. Don't you think her friends are going to think twice before they go to get help? So, and we, again, know this is true, that people express that they're afraid to get help for domestic violence, for lack of housing, for medical problems that their children have, for fear that they will wrongfully have their children taken from them. So this whole system operates under a punitive logic that claims that the harms to children are child maltreatment caused by pathological parents who have certain cognitive deficits or other kinds of psychological problems, And so the cure is to cure the parent and supervise them instead of getting to the root causes of unmet needs of children in America. I really like the way that Malcolm X described how this system operates. He himself was taken along with his siblings from his mother after his father was killed, and his mother was struggling to care for the family, for the children, and they were all put in foster care. And he said, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. And that's how I see this system operating. We live in a society that crushes people by forcing them to stay in poverty through lots of structural barriers to education and better wages and better housing. And then when they can't take care of their children, they're punished for it and blamed for it. And that becomes an excuse for not ending the root causes of the harms to children. So I just want to end with some ways that activists around the country are addressing what needs to be done about this system. And many, including myself, are saying we can't continue to just tweak it. We need a radical change in how we address children's needs in America. And that means dismantling this system. You know, it's not going to end right away. There's no way of tearing it down. But there are ways of reducing the power of the system, like giving parents Miranda rights, like increasing the availability of lawyers in legal services offices who specialize in defending families, ending mandated reporting, ending involuntary drug testing of pregnant people and newborns. And then at the very same time, reimagining what would it take to actually meet the needs of children in America? And what are the policies? What are community-based resources that people can turn to when they're having struggles caring for their children? And when it comes to physical abuse, which is a small percentage of why children end up in foster care, but there are children who are physically abused, the system has failed to protect them. In fact, you probably hear all the time, well, I shouldn't say all the time, because it's actually, it gets in the news because it's so rare that a parent kills their child. That's a rare event. But when it does happen, very often you see children known to system or child known to system. Okay, so the system knew about it and didn't do anything about it. It failed to protect children, and there are better ways of protecting children, dealing with violence in families, than the way we're dealing with it now. There are people who are developing transformative justice approaches that do a better job of getting at the root cause for why there's violence is going on in the family and dealing with the violence, ending the violence without disrupting, destroying the family and causing even more harm to the children by putting them in a harmful foster system. So I believe that we can reimagine how we care for children and create a society based in communities where families are truly supported instead of being punished, where children's needs are met instead of offering therapeutic cures that don't work to families, and where they're kept safe because they have the resources that they need. So I'll end there, and thanks for your attention, and I look forward to some discussion with you. Thank you so much. Hello.
I would think that many of my peers and I are so separated from this issue because of our privilege. So first off, thank you for coming and educating us about it. This has been amazing.
Thank you.
And second, I completely agree that the system needs to be reimagined completely. And I know that you mentioned briefly some of the avenues on which to do that. But which avenues do you think are the most helpful in achieving more equity? And then furthermore, what are things that we can do in order to achieve that equity? I feel like oftentimes because this isn't an issue that we see in our everyday lives, it's so easy to have it just go on the back burner.
Yes,
But what are some tangible things that we as students can do to help create some sort of change?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. It's hard to pick one thing, that I think is most important. I think what I would emphasize is that it has to be both reducing the power of the system to separate families and building up the resources that families have. So for example, with mandated reporting, I speak with so many doctors because a lot of my work is about racism in medicine as well. And I'll tell you, doctors now want to hear about this subject because they're struggling with it. They're told we have to report suspicions of child maltreatment. And what they know, they're mostly reporting, it's not abuse of children, they're reporting needs that children have. Families who have insecure housing or not enough food, not enough clothing. And they know that when they report, there's the risk that the children are going to be taken from their families, and that's not what they want. So they wonder, what can we do? Now, it would help them to have a law or to change the law, either change the law of mandated reporting or repeal the federal statute that requires it, which there is a movement to do. And so that they don't have to feel that somehow I'm going to be punished if I don't report every suspicion I might have that a child has an unmet need. But at the same time, they need ways to meet the needs of the children. So one thing that some hospitals are doing is medical legal partnerships where they have caseworkers who don't work for Child Protective Services, they work for the hospital, and they have lawyers and the doctors, and they can get together and figure it out. Family defenders, for example, are multidisciplinary. It's the lawyers and social workers who work for the lawyers, so they don't have to report anything. They're protected by attorney-client privilege, and these are parents who've experienced this. And so, those together. So overall, it's both. So what can you do? You can look up organizations. So right at the bottom here, I have an image of Joyce McMillan, JMAC for Families in New York City, which is an abolitionist organization she's before the New York State Assembly proposing legislation there to reduce the power, give parents rights, but they have the rights, apply the rights, enforce the rights. And in Philadelphia, there's Community Legal Services that has a family advocacy unit. So one thing you can do is work with, support in some way, find out how can I help organizations that are doing this work already. Another is to just be, now you're attuned to this issue, and you can now notice when there's some kind of legislation that is promoting support for families. Anything that reduces poverty, child poverty in particular, and supports families is going to be a way to reduce the power of the family policing system because you're providing an alternative for how to care for children. You're making it less likely that children will be taken from their homes. So those are some things that you can do. And I would say, if you're thinking of either going into law or social work, to look for organizations that are trying to end this practice rather than working for the ones that are separating children from their families. And there's more and more of that today than ever before. I'll mention one other resource, which is the Upend movement. all of these have websites that you can look up more information about. That is centered in University of Houston College Graduate School of Social Work, and they have lots of information on their website about how to reduce the power of the child welfare system and build up community-based resources for families. Lots of webinars, you know, it's really a great resource to learn more about this topic. So thanks so much for your question.
Hi, thank
Hello.
you for your insights today.
Sure.
I have kind of a three-part question.
Okay, I'll try to keep it in my head.
The first two parts are directly connected, so I hope that makes it easier.
Okay, that'll help.
So my first question is, do you consider the child welfare system a means of population control? And also along with that, the second part one, is there, and if so, where is the distinction between white saviorism, which is framed usually as kind of passive and benign, and the more active militant control that you voiced here today?
Yeah.
And the third question is kind of directly related to your book, Killing the Black Body,
Yeah.
where you talk about mainly maternal oppression through drug use, but also kind of an underlying aspect of maternal oppression as culturally and racially dangerous to white America.
Yeah.
So my question was, what does Black maternal protest look like, especially in the cases you presented today?
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, it is a form of population control. It's a form of supervising, monitoring, and also oppressing a community. This is why the U.S. military used family separation, child removal as a weapon of war, because it realized that when you take children away from their families, you're traumatizing them and their families, and you have the power now to mold that child in whatever way you want that can oppose the interests of their community and their families. So, we know that family separation, child removal has been used over and over and over again globally as a form of oppression. That was recognized. Remember when President Trump increased the removal of children at the border? Huge outcry. All these experts came out, they wrote briefs in federal court, there were op-eds in every major newspaper about how it was so harmful to children to separate them from their families, and how this had long-lasting effects. And some even pointed out that under UN conventions, it's considered a form of torture. Well, many Americans recognize that. I think Americans in general were opposed to those separations. And there was a federal judge that found it was a violation of the US Constitution. And yet, Black children are removed from their homes at higher rates than ever happened to children at the border during that period. And yet there isn't the same kind of outcry about that. So we know that this is a political weapon, a political form of monitoring and controlling a population. I wrote an article, I talk about it in Torn Apart, called The Racial Geography of Child Welfare, where I point out that child welfare agency involvement in every city, every big city, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, it's concentrated in the most impoverished Black neighborhoods. So the whole neighborhood is affected in a negative way by this agency. Everybody in the neighborhood, all the children in the neighborhood know what this agency is. That is a form of surveillance and supervision of the entire community. And it has harmful effects. So many children taken from their families, especially when they're put in a system that is well documented to harm them. It's a pathway to juvenile delinquency and prison. And so, I should have mentioned that earlier, it's another connection. So it has a harmful impact on the ability of everyone in that neighborhood to thrive in society. It's harmful to their health, it's harmful to their education, it's harmful to their economic well-being. it makes them economically more precarious than before. You know, if you're an impoverished mother trying to care for your children, and child welfare agents come in and take your children away without giving you any resources to care for your children, and just say, okay, you've got to go parent training classes, you've got to go visit your children in all different parts of the city, you've got to look for a better job, you've got to look for better housing, and you're trying to do all these things to get your children back, you're less likely to be able to find and keep a job. People lose their jobs because of all these tasks they have to do. You know, do I have time to tell a story, a quick story? Okay, so I recently spoke to a domestic violence group in Massachusetts, and about this topic and the connection between domestic violence and the way in which Child Protective Services deals with it, which is to take children away from their mothers if their mothers have experienced domestic violence. And one of the workers there said she had been working with a mother in a homeless shelter who had children, I don't remember the number of children, let's say 3 children, I don't remember the exact number. They were all living in the homeless shelter, escaping violence in the home. So this mother was trying to protect her children. And the worker had worked with her to get a job, to get better housing, to get out of the homeless shelter. And they were about to leave when someone in the shelter called the child abuse hotline on this mother. So now caseworkers came in, took the children away from her. What do you think that does to a mother who is trying to protect her children? It makes you depressed and distraught. And she has all these tasks she has to fulfill. It completely ruined her chances of getting a job because she couldn't spend her time looking for a job. She had to spend it going all over the city, visiting with her children who had been separated from her, going to parent training classes, going to therapy, because the problem isn't that she didn't have a housing, it was that something must be wrong with her to live in a homeless shelter. You know, something must be wrong with her because she had a violent partner. And all these things that didn't help the family at all. And this worker was saying, this system made this mother worse off. It made the children worse off. So imagine that at a community level. Now, where does white saviorism come in? I suppose you could say it's seen as something kind of benign, but that ideology supports this mass removal of Black children from their communities because it reinforces the view that Black children must be better off somewhere else than with their families. And this is something that there was an investigation done in Michigan, and they literally put that in the report, that they saw over and over again this view at multiple levels of policymakers and administrators and caseworkers that Black children must be better off somewhere else, so it was okay to take them from their families. I would, to wrap it up, but what was your next, that was about the killing the Black body question? What was that? Remind me.
That was kind of just your take on what Black maternal protest looks like, especially in the examples you used today, or if that is even possible.
Okay, so I would also, along with my book, I would recommend a book called We Were Once a Family by Roxana Asgharian, and it's about the case of, that you may have read about, 2 white women who adopted 2 sets of siblings, and eventually it was a murder-suicide. They drove the whole family off a cliff in California, killing all of the children. But what Roxana focuses on is how these children ended up adopted, taken from their families, and adopted by these 2 women, and how, despite being charged with child abuse at one point, and then they just moved away, and then they just kept the children at home. The daughter, one of them, escaping and trying to get help from a neighbor. You know, people knew, you could see online that these children were emaciated. But the idea that these women were saving these children, and they promoted that in their Facebook feed. They said we saved these children from their black parents, their neglectful black parents, as they were neglecting them, obviously. But that ideology papers over the harm that's being done. And so I wouldn't disconnect them as two different ways of thinking about what's going on with the system. I think, as I've emphasized throughout my talk, I don't think stereotypes are everything, but I think they do help to fuel and excuse and justify the violence that's committed against black families. Black maternal protest, absolutely. I feel like you asked me a different question, but anyway, I have my last chapter of Shattered Bonds focuses on black mothers who have experienced the system and are the leaders of the movement to end it, like Joyce McMillan, her daughters were taken from her based on a positive drug test, and it took her a couple years to get them back from foster care, and she became an activist against this system and in favor of supports for families. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's essential, actually. I think it's essential. Thanks for your questions.
We'll have a quick question.
Yeah, I
Okay, one last quick
Okay.
question, and we'll let everyone go.
All right.
Dr. Roberts, I'm just curious on what has been your biggest opposition to what you're doing, or what details are greatly appreciated?
Yeah, sure. Well, the biggest idea opposing this is that we have to have this system to protect children. And usually people will point to the cases of children being killed in their homes as the reason we have to keep the system. My response to that is, well, this system is harming far more children, and there are children who are killed in foster care. The rates of death and suicide of children in foster care, murders and suicide of children, or homicides anyway, and suicides, is really high compared to the general population. And so, but the main harm isn't death, it's all the things I've been talking about. So my response is, why would we keep a system that we know is so harmful because of the exceptional cases of harm that it may be preventing? Wouldn't we do better to figure out a better way of preventing that harm and taking better care of children? So that's the main objection. Now, who makes that objection? People who work for the system. The reason why Joyce McMillan has been advocating, along with lots of other people as well, she has a whole team of people, including scholars and lawyers and legislators who have supported the bill for Miranda rights and more resources for lawyers and getting a warrant before you search a home. And she hasn't been able, or they haven't been able to get this bill passed because the Administration for Children's Services opposes it. They're just boldly saying, no, we don't want to tell parents what their constitutional rights are. And so there's the opposition to the most radical, if you want to call that I don't see why telling people their constitutional rights is radical, but it's considered radical. Those things. And the main way, though, that child protection departments oppose ending their approach is to soften what they do. Like the lawsuit in Washington State, where the department was supposedly cooperating with us, but they didn't make any major changes, to seem as if they're changing things, but they're not really fundamentally changing anything. And one of the main things that's happened is reducing the numbers of children in foster care. The numbers have reduced substantially since the 1990s. But the surveillance of families and the investigation of families hasn't. And so in some ways, by making it seem as if we're putting fewer children in foster care, we're providing services to families, it seems like we've solved the problem, when in fact, as I pointed out, those services are mandated tasks that people have to perform, and they can expand the net of families that are investigated because it doesn't seem as if it's as bad as it used to be. I'll just mention one other group, which are child welfare researchers. Now, there is a growing body of research now showing the harms of the foster system, showing, like I showed before, the massive extent of investigations and child removals and terminations of parental rights. Sociologists now are writing books about this. It never happened before. Kelly Fong, for example, has a new book out called Investigating Families, all about the harms of investigations and mandated reporting. She's been very outspoken against mandated reporting based on her interviews with caseworkers and families in Connecticut and Rhode Island. So we're getting lots more research by people who are calling to end this system, but at the same time, there's a backlash against the researchers who want to keep the system. And their main argument is there's nothing wrong with the fact that there's so many black children in the system. The problem is that black children have more needs, and the system is meeting their needs. And so, my response is it's not meeting their needs. If black children have more needs, then let's find a better way of meeting their needs. To me, that's not a justification for the system we have. And I'm going to go back, if I can. I now remember what you said that I thought I needed to answer, which was my point in Killing the Black Body, that these kinds of punitive policies are harmful for white people too. And I want to make that point because I don't want to make it sound as if this is just harmful for black people, and it's fine for white people. As I pointed out, there's a long history of taking impoverished white people from their parents as well. And there are a lot of white children in foster care, and they're mostly impoverished white children. Now the prosecutions and removal of newborns from pregnant women and new mothers has expanded to white mothers as well. Used to just be black mothers. Now they're taking children from white mothers too, who are accused of using drugs if they're poor. Not if they're wealthy, if they're poor. And more fundamentally, it upholds a way of caring for children in our nation that doesn't give support to people who are struggling to care for their children. Whether it's because they're impoverished, whether it's because they're in a segregated black community, whether they're white and impoverished, or even whether they're professionals who can't, have to pay a fortune for childcare. You know what I mean? Like it maintains an idea that caregivers are on their own. And if you can't handle it, we'll take your children away from you or just let you suffer. And that is bad for everybody. I'll recommend one other book, which is Jonathan Metzl's book, Dying of Whiteness. He points out how all of these policies that are directed at harming black people also harm white people. That white people who are impoverished don't have adequate health care either. They don't go to great schools either. They don't have great housing either. But by supporting policies that harm black people, many white people are actually harming themselves. They're harming themselves. And we could have a society that is better for everybody. But we can't, we will never have it as long as we continue this idea that black mothers are the blame for everything. So let's punish them and we'll be okay. No, punishing black mothers is a way of maintaining a system, a way of thinking, of caring for each other that's bad for everybody. Everybody. So that's my other answer to your question. I think that's it then. Okay.
I want to thank you for being here.
Oh,
Thank you so
sure.
much.
My
And
pleasure.
if we could thank Professor Roberts.
Thank you so much.